All right, welcome back, Sean Kelly, to my YouTube channel for part two of our conversation about your text, Individuation and the Absolute. We've quickly found out last time that we had a lot to talk about. I had 8 slides prepared. I believe we got through 4. Um, and for those of you who don't know, Sean is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he specializes in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. At some point, I'd love to talk to you more about where you work and what sort of research goes on there. Um, and perhaps we can weave that a little bit into what we're going to talk about. I mean, if Jordan, if you could progress us to the next slide, I thought it might be good for Sean to help orient the whole conversation. If in case you didn't catch part one of our conversation, just to talk about what complex holism means to him, how it originates out of Hegel, and its relationship to Jung. And perhaps you could say something about your research at your institution.
Sure. Well, it's great to be back, Luke. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this part two. Um, well, let me begin just with this term complex holism. It's a term that I proposed in this book to capture what I was trying to accomplish, or what I was hoping would arise through the encounter between Hegel and Jung. Um, as you know, well, both Hegel and Jung have a there's a great emphasis on the concept of wholeness. We could say on the intuition of wholeness. Individuation can be described as the path of wholeness, actualization of the self being the psyche in its totality, or the psyche as a whole. Um, Hegel famously says in the preface to the Phenomenology that the true is the whole. And he adds that and the whole is nothing other than the process of its own actualization or development. So for both figures, wholeness is a central concept here. While I was writing, actually toward the end of writing this text, I encountered the French thinker Edgar Morin, whose key guiding concept for his work is complexity. Now, Morin, I don't know whether if your listeners are familiar with him. Edgar Morin will turn 105 actually in August, and he just came out with his latest little book at 105. Anyway, I went to study with Morin in Paris in 1985, 86 for a year, and he from that point on became a core influence in my thinking. He's really shaped my thinking. He became a mentor and a friend. So complex holism wouldn't have happened. The idea for me wouldn't have happened without my encounter with Edgar Morin. And Morin counts among one of his main formative influences Hegel, not surprisingly. He spent a lot of time with the phenomenology when he was quite young, and the logic, actually. Um, he came to Hegel, though, through Marx. So Morin, yeah, I mean, he fought in the French Resistance. He was initially a Marxist, but through the Marxist tradition went back to Hegel. And not only Hegel, he went back into the Western tradition all the way to Heraclitus. So where he likes to cite some of his philosophers, as he calls them, starting with Heraclitus, but Hegel figures prominently. All right, so complexity for Morin obviously draws from the complexity sciences, from sciences of ecology, cybernetics, and so on. But in his hands, um, it involves the not only a feature of all living organization, whether that's a single cell or a body or an ecosystem or even the planet as a whole, but any living system. So it can be a biological system, but it can be a system of ideas as well. Morin has articulated and identified and articulated these calls principles of complexity. One of which, very important, he calls the dialogic, and he is self-consciously being continuous with Hegel and differentiating from Hegel's understanding of the dialectic. As you know, for Hegel, the dialectic is a principle of all thought, even of all life, as Hegel says, and it involves the encounter between opposing principles, tension of opposites, much as we find in Jung. Um, but for Hegel, this is debatable, but many people interpret Hegel as always imagining these opposites being resolved in a so-called synthesis. So the common view of Hegel's dialectic is the encounter between a thesis, its antithesis, and then a synthesis. Even though Hegel himself doesn't like that characterization of the dialectic. In any case, there's the Hegelian dialectic that we can associate with, in Hegel's hands, with the idea of a, at least at the limit, a systemic closure, which for Hegel is the system of the science of wisdom, he calls it. Ontologically, it's absolute spirit. So Morin doesn't want to settle with any kind of closure. I mean, he does recognize obviously that there are boundaries. The cell has a boundary. Every system has a relative closure, but it's also relatively open. So instead of the dialectic, he says that there's the dialogic, and he defines the dialogic as the symbiotic combination or encounter of two or more logics, that's to say, narratives or principles, which remain simultaneously complementary and antagonistic. Okay, so this is key. So the key feature of complexity for Morin is the ability of the system in question to maintain the tension of opposites without falling into a premature synthesis or resolution. Okay, so this is Morin. So to distinguish the holism that I saw coming out of the encounter between Hegel and Jung from more popular versions of holism, where we often see, for example, charts where we have the old paradigm, which is dualistic, and the new paradigm, which is holistic. And these are opposites. So it's a new dualism between holism and,
Mhm.
and the old paradigm. That's too simplistic. So to distinguish the holism that I see both Hegel and Jung working towards, uh, I, I, I was really helped by Morin's principles of complexity and wanted to characterize the whole in question as a complex whole. So, yes, it's a whole, it's a totality, but it's a totality that only lives with the tension of opposites, which the tension the tension is never completely abolished, because when the tension is abolished, the system itself dies. And I'll just end with this one quote here that Morin likes to often make from the Nobel Prize winning chemist François Jacob. So François Jacob, he defined life as that which maintains itself at the temperature of its own destruction. Okay, so we can see that even with the sun. The sun maintains itself through this balance between the forces of gravity that want to make it all implode on the one hand, and the strong nuclear force of fission that wants to make it explode. And so that dynamic tension between these two powers is what makes the sun the sun. And for Jacob and for Morin, and I think for Hegel and Jung, that's also true of their view of life, of the psyche, of spirit, hence complex holism. Okay.
So would it be fair to say that if we're talking about to give another real world example or an abstract world example of this, use the sun, but to make it relevant to our talk about Hegel and Jung,
Mm.
is that perhaps they're describing different aspects of the same phenomenon and they exist in sort of an antagonism that you would perhaps call dialogic.
Yes,
Is that right? And
that's
then
it exactly.
and when we think about the totality of it, then we have the complex holism on this particular issue.
That's right, and it even implies applies to the relation between Hegel and Jung, because on
Mm,
the one hand they share their commitment to wholeness.
right.
On the other hand, as you know, there are significant differences with Hegel emphasizing conceptual articulation system, Jung emphasizing symbolic expression, the unconscious, the irrational, and so on. So there, Hegel and Jung are really intent. There is a real tension between them, but their common commitment to wholeness is able to embrace that tension without dissolving it. So to be able to bring Hegel and Jung together requires a principle of complex holism, even as that encounter helps us articulate the principle of complex holism.
What I think is interesting and what you just said is through Moran. Is it Moran? Moran?
Morin.
In.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the first time I've heard of him, although the people in my audience might be well acquainted with him. And I don't know. I mean, I imagine since you said you studied with him in Paris. I don't know if he has some connection to Desjardins. I'd be
Um, he was definitely aware of yeah, Teilhard, all of these people. I mean, he's so well known in France. He's known everywhere in the world except for the United. We could talk about why he's not as well known in the United States, but there's
I'd love to know why. I mean, that's why. I mean, I come up with a bunch of questions, but truthfully, the ones that spontaneously erupt are oftentimes more interesting to me. But so what I thought was interesting in what you just said is how through Morin you traced Hegel back to Heraclitus, or he did. He did.
yes, he does. Yeah, he
Yeah.
definitely situates Hegel in this lineage that goes back to Heraclitus. Yeah.
Well, I think I if I unless I think you've read Jung more deeply than I have, but it's my understanding that Jung takes a lot of inspiration from Heraclitus as well. And this is something I've done in the videos on my channel trying to get my mind around it. I've kind of backpedaled a little bit preparing for our conversation today because we're going to talk a little bit about what God means to both Jung and Hegel. That is something I'd like to talk about, and whether or not God is something. The way that I kind of was poking around, it almost seems like there are a lot of people who don't really think that God was this objective thing that's outside of the individual for Jung, but yet at the same time, I tend to think about Jung thinking of God in a Heraclitean sense as some sort of fire
Mhm.
behind the scenes. But perhaps we'll get to that um, a little further down the line if you want to expound on that. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about Morin and his unpopularity in the United States.
Yeah, well, it's not that he's unpopular; he's just not known. And one of the reasons is because the American academe was basically dominated by a certain strand of French thinking that comes out of the deconstructionists with Derrida and
Mm.
post-structuralists, Deleuze, Guattari, and these people. And once deconstruction became sort of the agenda for American academics in the humanities, they just ignored Morin and they translated all of the others, but they ignored him because Morin, he's in dialogue with the sciences, with the humanities, but in a way that is um, I don't know, so much more relevant, I think, and his French is also so much more clear and accessible than many of these other French authors. But so I
I
think, yeah. Hmm.
I noticed something similar when I was doing my dissertation on Soren Kierkegaard. I was never formally taught Kierkegaard at any stage of my academic training, undergraduate, master's, PhD, and it was something I had to do in independent studies and completely teach myself because of institutional bias against that particular thinker. And I think the reason why I bring that up, not only to say, "Oh, look, this is a parallel with Morin's teaching," but also Kierkegaard was in conversation with Hegel and developed a lot of his own thinking um, in response to Hegel. And I think that that I don't know if you address Kierkegaard in thinking through your idea of complex holism, or if you just squarely had it focused on Jung and Morin and other individuals. But um, yeah, it just brought to mind
Yeah,
that experience of mine.
yeah. I don't address Kierkegaard in that text, but in my own thinking and development, um, he's been important, and I see the relation between Hegel and Kierkegaard in a way similar, different, but there's a parallel in the relation between Hegel and Jung. So just
Right.
as Hegel and Jung are antagonistic at a certain level, and yet they share a common core. Um, I the way I think of the relation of Hegel to Kierkegaard is that if you take Hegel at his word in terms of the nature of the not only of the dialectic but of the whole, if it's truly a both and thinking, and if Kierkegaard is either or, the only coherent both and must include both and either or.
Mhm.
So
Right.
so there can't be you can't be true to me to the insight that Hegel leads us to without at a certain point opening yourself to what Kierkegaard opens us to, which is that the mind and reason is incapable well, certainly incapable by itself of bringing any sort of salvation, but it can't bring the individual beyond itself, which is the mind. You need a an active will, an opening of the heart, and you have to choose at a certain point. So that radical existential invitation to, and this is true with Nietzsche too, to and his problem with Hegel. Um, at a certain point, for the things that really matter most in life, the mind, however subtle, just won't get us there. We need something more,
Right.
where there's a choice, an existential choice. So my view is that, yeah, Hegel. If you really get Hegel, you've got to be Kierkegaardian also.
That's great. That's fantastic. What's interesting, we're talking about all these different relationships between these philosophers, what Jung had to say about all these different philosophers as well, you
Mm,
know, as we're trying to bring them into conversation as you're disparaging. It's just so interesting when you get at the highest levels of different thought patterns and systems, how much how much acrimony there can be between different world historical thinkers.
it's so
It's
true.
it's wild. Maybe we should progress to the next slide
Sure.
if that's okay, if Jordan is there to progress us. Um, the, slide that I'm interested in, this wasn't something that you talked about specifically in your book, but because you were such a educated person, I really wanted to get your thoughts on it. On Twitter, every once in a while, I see this text by McGee, Hegel, and the Hermetic tradition floating around, and of course, I've done enough research into Jung to know about how deeply he read in the occult and alchemy. I guess first of all, have you read this McGee text? Did
Oh
you come
yeah.
across it for your? Is there anything to it? Is it worthwhile? I think
Oh,
there's some talk about. Is it Jakob Burma? Is that how you say his name?
yep. Jakob
Yeah.
Böhme and Franz von Bader and Oettinger and yeah. I mean, Glenn. I know Glenn. I mean, we.
Oh wow, you're the right person. I had no idea you were on a first name basis with. I
Oh
didn't even know
yeah.
you read the book.
Well, we
I
haven't talked
suspected
this.
you had.
I wondered about him. We haven't talked in probably about 10 years, but for a while there, I mean, we were both part of this Esalen Center for Theory and Research sort of think tank invitational conference. I got to know him there, and then he came out to CIS a couple of times, and we hung out. But I haven't talked to him in a long time. But yeah, just the other day, I was rereading little sections of this book, and particularly that diagram on the cover. I was trying to refresh my memory about that diagram that Glenn has on the cover that was found in Hegel's papers. It seems,
Oh really?
yeah, it seems to be an early diagram from early Hegel, probably in the Jena period, um, and it's quite cryptic. I mean, it's got these it's got a triangle in the middle, and then three smaller triangles on each of the points of the triangle, and then all of these symbols, some of which are the symbols for the planets, and others seem to be more alchemical symbols. Uh, so, I mean, we know that Hegel was very familiar with Jakob Böhme, and Böhme is, of course, a main source, a bridge between the alchemical tradition, particularly coming out of Paracelsus, on the one hand, and later German idealism. So Böhme is the bridge there. So Hegel definitely knew his Böhme, and he has a long section on Böhme in the lectures on the history of philosophy also. So he recognizes that Böhme was intuiting the nature of the absolute, but he feels that that Burma was not able to extract himself from the sensual character of the mythopoeic imagination and raise his intuition to the level of the clarity of the concept, as Hegel calls it, the Begriff. Um, so, but both Burma and Hegel, they're Trinitarian. This is the thing. If you Hegel is in this long tradition of mystical Trinitarianism, and there is a non-Christian parallel in Neoplatonism, which which is also Trinitarian in many ways. But Hegel comes out of more of a mystical Christian Trinitarianism that has its roots in, especially not only in Burma, but Joachim of Fiore.
Mm,
Um, yeah, Hegel was steeped in this like many of his contemporaries, and because he's coming after Kant, after the Enlightenment, he has a commitment to reason and to the ideal of philosophy that he gets from Kant as system. So for philosophy to be true, for wisdom to be wisdom, it has to take the form of system. And by system, he means a form of speech or discourse that is conceptual and which is internally coherent. And that includes being able to give an account of itself uh, and its own development toward the articulation of the system as a whole. And of course, Hegel does this in his system, the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and particularly in the logic. So, yeah, he draws from Burma and probably other Christian theosophical figures, but he translates all of that into his own particular medium, which is a post-Kantian one.
I mean, it was coming across this text and hearing you validate some of my suspicions about what this text is about. It's really the first time I ever heard of Hegel deep drinking from those waters. Of course, I think the way again, back to our critique of the academy, I think that it's my experience that uh, the the mystical aspects or the occult leanings of major figures are often sanitized in an effort to make them more respectable. But I find that knowing this is so much more rewarding than having the edited version. I'm curious when you talk about how he's coming from a certain tradition. I take it that that's not just like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Perhaps I can translate it into this other type of philosophical language. I guess I'm kinda curious, and it's not really the subject of today's conversation, but I'm so interested in this. What it meant to come from that tradition? Were there initiation rites? Were there membership to societies? I have no idea. I'm just curious if you know off the top of your head.
Yeah. Well, in Hegel's time, of course, there were the Masonic lodges. There may have been some, lingering Rosicrucian societies, and certainly, the Rosicrucian tradition, had some influence on Hegel. I mean, he talks about what is the reference now? He talks about the rose and the cross in the phenomenology. It's actually in the last part of the phenomenology. I mean, he makes an explicit reference
Sure.
to the
Yeah.
rose and the cross.
The Rose
So,
Cross. Yeah.
yeah, but my understanding is that Hegel himself was not part of any of these secret societies.
Interesting. I mean, I think with Jung, wasn't Jung's grandfather very steeped in these societies? I it escapes me. I'll
Um,
look it up.
yeah, I don't remember that. Jung was steeped in the literature, certainly, but I don't think he was part of these societies. But it's interesting because just 2 days ago, in the course that I'm co-teaching with my colleague Becca Tarnas, we're doing a seminar on Jung now, actually, and we were just looking at Jung's Seven Sermons to the Dead, which is now part of the Red Book. So it's a very early text that Jung wrote, Seven Sermons of the Dead, in the voice of Basilides. Now, Basilides was an ancient Gnostic from Alexandria. And this text that Jung wrote is basically, it's like a Gnostic text.
Right.
Uh, and it describes the nature of the Godhead in terms of what the Gnostics called the pleroma. So the pleroma is a Greek word for fullness, but it's the fullness of the Godhead prior to there being any cosmos. So it's in more orthodox terms, we can think of the Trinity. So the Trinity, God is Trinity, and maybe you could think of the choir of angels as well that existed prior to the creation. The Gnostics called that the pleroma, and the all of the Gnostics, particularly the, let's say, the Valentinian Gnostics, give this account of the a kind of theogony, or the generation of the Godhead out of this, what Jakob Böhme will call Ungrund, which Schelling and others will translate into the notion of the unconscious. Okay, so let me just give you one thread here. Schelling is the one who invents the term the unconscious in German,
Right.
das Unbewusst. But he is modifying Jakob Böhme's idea, metaphysical idea of the unground, the Ungrund, which is this mysterious, trans-rational intuition of the Godhead, right? So um, these ideas, you first find them in with the Gnostic scriptures and their descriptions of the pleroma, which always begins with this figure of depth or silence, or forefather, and so on. I'm bringing this up because with the Gnostics, from this mysterious Ungrund in the pleroma, you will get a generation of twin ions or emanations. Like one would be nous and aletheia, so mind and truth, and eventually you might have Sophia and something else. And in the Gnostic system, there's 15 pairs of these ions. They're called ions. So Jung took, one of Jung's books is called Ion. He takes that from the Valentinian Gnostic system of the pleroma, and also Jung's idea of the anima and the animus, which together he calls the syzygy. In his book Ion, one of the chapters is called the syzygy, anima animus. The syzygy is the Gnostic term for these pairs of emanations that come out of the Ungrund, right? So Jung is really consciously borrowing from the Gnostics here.
Sure.
Now, take Hegel. If you take the logic of Hegel, which would, it's in one ways is the complete opposite of this kind of mythopoeic fantasy of the Godhead, and yet it actually is like a translation of that process into the form of the concept. The logic begins with being. So actually, the logic, according to Hegel, is the nature of God as he exists before the creation of the world and a finite spirit. This is how Hegel defines the logic. He says we can think of the logic as God as he exists prior to the creation of the cosmos and consciousness. Okay. Well, that sounds like the Gnostic pleroma to me.
Right. Yeah.
And then when you look at the logic of Hegel, it begins not with the Ungrund, but with being. And he says, but what is being? It's not this thing or that thing. In fact, it's no thing. It's nothing. So there's this paradox of being and nothing, which is at the beginning of Hegel's logic.
That's
And
right.
that generates a whole series of other polarities: quantity, quality, measure, limit, and so on. Just like the Gnostic pleroma, until you come to the last category of the logic, which is the absolute idea, the whole. And that's when the pleroma, or Hegel's logic, is full and is ready for creation, which gives us the next part of the system, which is the philosophy of nature and then the philosophy of spirit. So, I mean, Hegel's system is in many ways a culmination of what began with these Gnostic speculations and even the Neoplatonic systems of emanation. But now demythologized and translated into a purely coherent, systematic, conceptual mode. I mean, it's so brilliant. But I can't remember if Glenn makes that connection between Hegel's logic and the Gnostic pleroma. But if he doesn't, that would be a good addition.
Well, I might have to use you for your contacts one day. I think talking to Becca Tarnas and Glenn about the respective research areas would be wonderful if
Oh yeah,
possible.
happy to put you in
Yeah,
touch.
yeah. Yeah, excellent. I did while you were setting that up, I did just a quick Google. I think it was Jung's grandfather, Carl Gustav, who was. There's a little link over here that I included in our chat to New York Times link that said that he was the Grand Master of Switzerland or something like that.
Really? That's neat. I didn't remember that.
But I was processing what you were saying and skimming that to make sure I hadn't said something out of turn. So do fact check me to make sure I got that right. But yeah, uh, s- yeah. So I don't know if you want to speak any more about how these occult influences affected the complex holism work.
Hmm. Um, well, I mean, they're certainly there in Jung. I mean, I think they're there in Jung and Hegel, but Jung makes no bones about it. He's always drawing from, as you know, from alchemy and the Gnostics and so on. But Hegel doesn't. Hegel's covered his tracks pretty much, except for in his lectures on the history of philosophy, where he deals explicitly with Burma. But in his published works, he doesn't draw from these traditions explicitly.
Okay. Well, perhaps we should proceed to the next slide,
Sure.
slide 8. And I believe this is gonna be the one on and I'm after I kinda set it up, I think I've got this table. I don't know how you feel about AI, but I've been using Grok a lot to help me with my research and presentations, which is perhaps relevant to what we're talking about here. I I don't know if you had a chance to tangle with AI and
Yeah, I've been playing around quite a bit, but I haven't used Grok yet, so maybe I'll check that one out.
I it's the first one that I've really dealt with in a substantive way. It's like having research assistants. It's interesting. I haven't really developed all my thinking about it. I would really like to perhaps discourse on that someday with somebody who's deep in the field. But yeah, I think what I'd like to do is, and I've got a little chart that Grok helped me put together. That's why I brought that up in the next slide. But we'll stay right here for right now. Is and we is trying to get our minds around the differences between um, I guess what I'm calling Hegel's God and Jung's God.
Mhm.
Um, I have a lot of I have a lot of different conflicting thoughts about this. If we because sometimes, like I said, when we were tracing the Heraclitean influence on Hegel and Jung, it doesn't really seem to me that uh, God is completely subjective for Jung, but perhaps I'm always guilty because I believe in God. I'm always guilty of trying to read theology into things, or I've been that accusation has been made against me when I was doing my graduate work. Um, I don't know. I'm just kind of curious to hear what you have to say about the differences in their conceptions of God, and if God is something objective at all for Jung. Because, and as I included this diagram down here, it seems to me, I like to think of Jung as a type of panentheist, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah. Well, Jung, I think, is contradictory. Um,
Shocking.
yeah, and that's all right. I mean, self. Who was it said self consistency is a hobgoblin of small minds, something like that. I can't.
Mm,
But so on the one hand, Jung says that he's bracketing. I mean, he's trying. He says he's a good Kantian, and to be a good Kantian means that we can think God, but we can't know God. So knowledge, God is not a possible object of knowledge, according to Kant. Just as the soul and the universe as a whole, they're necessary ideas, regulative ideas that without which we couldn't uh, have systematic knowledge. But we can't know them in the same way that we can know the nature of geometry or the chemical composition of you know, the elements and so on, um, because God, the soul, and the universe as a whole are not accessible through our sensory apparatus, according to Kant. So, Jung says he's following Kant. He says, I, can't know God. I'm a scientist. I'm going to confine myself, as Kant said, to phenomena, as things. I'm going to confine myself to what arises in the field of experience. And he says, from that point of view, God features in experience. So God is phenomenologically real, but I'm not going to even try to pronounce on the ontological reality of God. So that's Jung being a good Kantian. But then if we stick to that phenomenological perspective, Jung says, all right, people experience God in a way, or what they call God, and here he follows Rudolf Otto's phenomenology of the holy, the idea of the numinous, and so on. But he says that what people experience as God comes to them autonomously. It's not something that they create. So it's not a creation of the ego. And in that sense, it's objective. But more than that, if we look at the structural qualities of what he calls the God image, so if we just do a phenomenology of the way God appears in people's experience cross-culturally and across different times, we find that there's a common deep structure. And I mean, I'm saying this for some of your viewers. I know you know this already, but so he attributes this common deep structure to what he calls the collective unconscious. And his other word for the collective unconscious is the objective psyche.
Mm,
So, insofar as the God image is a product of the collective unconscious, it's a product of the objective psyche, and therefore it has objective existence in that sense.
right.
He just says that it's objective phenomenologically, and it's not created by the ego, but he won't pronounce on whether or not it exists somehow apart from our experience of it. Um, so he's trying to have it both ways in a way. Uh, Hegel,
And there really could be a lot of, if I could chime in there could be a lot of
yeah,
reasons about why he's trying to have it both ways, and
mm,
and it's, I guess, part of the reason why it's unfair to say, "Oh, Jung is contradictory about these particular issues, or perhaps paradoxical, irresolvably so," is, he's got a lot of writing, and he's got a lot of time to evolve, so he's allowed to change his mind and develop a new point of view. I've not read the entirety of Jung's works, but I know that there were certain things that were a higher priority to him earlier in his career versus later in his career, when he didn't care as much about being perceived as this rigorous scientist that was okay, talking about the things that are probably more at the fringes. Um, Saying that, I when we were all this God talk and Jung, what I got to thinking about, I don't know if you've seen that famous clip that's been circulating around on YouTube and shorts and things like that, and Instagram reels and whatnot, where someone asks him if he believes in God. He's like, "I don't believe, I know," or something to that effect. Um,
yeah, that was a major. I mean, when I that him saying that, did I share this in our previous talk? If I
uh,
did, forgive me. If I did, and if your viewers have seen it and you're listening to it again, forgive my memory lapse here. But my conversion experience to Jung. Did I tell you about that? I don't remember.
Refresh my memory. I don't think so. When during our first conversation, I watched so many videos of you because I didn't really anticipate, or I didn't really know how much material you had done when we first got together. Because I think it just so happened I cited your book and one of the Golden Bough things. You reached out. I was like, okay, we got it on the calendar. And then when I prepared, I was like, oh, Sean is everywhere. And so I had a, so, so I think I must have watched like 10 presentations or videos that you did. And so I can't remember if it came up in our conversation or there or not at all. So you're going to have to,
Okay, all right.
just for the
Well,
sake of everyone, go ahead and repeat it.
okay. Well, this is 1977. I'm in my second year as an undergraduate English literature in a course called Myth and Symbol, and the professor is showing us the first film on Jung, by Lawrence van der Post called The Story of C.G. Jung, which you can watch online now. We're watching it on a real like projector and so on. And it included this Freeman BBC interview, the black and white interview that you were talking about,
Yeah, yeah.
when he asks him. And when Jung said that, I don't believe, I know. And when he said that, I had what I later recognized as a Kundalini experience, and even Shaktipat, a kind of direct transmission from Jung. The my At the base of my spine, energy was released, went right up my spine and fanned out through the top of my head. And it was at that point that I became a Jungian.
Hmm.
And, from that point on, throughout my undergraduate and then my honors thesis, my master's thesis, my doctoral, I focused on Jung. Um,
So what's your
with
take on what he meant there? Because I think
Yeah, well,
it's
that's a
it's
good question.
enigmatic. It's so many people are like people are still debating about what he actually meant there. And,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
sounds like when you first heard it, it just resonated deep down. I doubt you cognized exactly what it means. What do you think he meant knowing what you know now?
yeah. Well, I don't think he meant that he knows in the way that he knows. It was more of like a gnosis knowing, a Gnostic knowing. Hans Jonas describes gnosis as direct and revealed knowledge. We could think of even like a Zen knowing. So it's a direct, intuitive knowing, but it's not a scientific knowing, and it's not a knowing it's not a knowing that's mediated by the senses, or organized by the categories of the understanding, a la Kant. So for Kant and Jung, when he's being a good Kantian, for something to count as knowledge, it has to be mediated through the senses and organized by the categories of the understanding, particularly causality, right? And the problem with God is that we can't. There's no way of proving that God exists, that God causes anything. I mean, you can give all sorts of arguments for the existence of God and so on, but you can give counter arguments. And for Kant, that leads to the so-called antinomies
Right.
of the reason, which shows the limits of knowledge. So, from that point of view, that Jung did not mean knowledge in a way that contradicts Kant. I think he meant knowledge in the sense of gnosis. I have direct,
Interesting.
intuitive experience of of what he would call the numinous, of yeah. So,
Oh, that's so I mean, this gets in and this feeds into the Hegel, bit that I interrupted you about, but I wonder if you could pick this up because you're talking about the objective psyche, as the collective unconscious, and perhaps thinking about the analog in Hegel's system. I wonder if you could expound upon that.
yeah. Well, I mean, Hegel says that philosophy and religion have the same content. Religion calls it God. Philosophy, by which he means particularly his system, will call it the absolute and absolute spirit. Um, yeah, so Hegel, I don't know what Hegel believed. Um, I mean, it's quite possible that, I don't know, and it's just I haven't been able to figure this out. Did Hegel have a kind of like two rooms in his psyche, one of which where he could, let's say, pray, and genuinely feel some kind of piety in the way that we think of in religious terms? Or did he always have to translate those, what he calls representations, or Jung will call them symbols, into the form of the concept for it to be meaningful to him? I mean, he certainly says that, like in his system, he says that the absolute can express itself, or does express itself, in three modes: through art, through religion, and through philosophy. And art is the most sensual, whether it's visual or auditory and so on. And the highest art will allow the individual to intuit the absolute through that mode. Religion adds both a ritual and a conceptual component, particularly through theology, dogma, doctrine, and then theology, which allows the translation of the symbol into a kind of hybrid between the sensual and the conceptual. But for Hegel, it's still not adequate for knowledge and wisdom, which is what he's after. So
And which
Hegel is
which is what he
after,
achieved, I believe is what he thought,
yeah, what
right?
he feels he achieved, and I think arguably he did. Um, and though I would say that once you achieve that, I think one can have a Kierkegaardian moment where one's, or like an Aquinas moment at the end of his life in his last sermon, where he said that everything I've achieved is straw,
Yeah, set it
is not,
ablaze,
yeah.
commit it to fire.
Yeah, and who knows what Hegel thought on it, or what his experience on his deathbed was. I mean, he might have had this insight, well, so what, hopefully not. Um,
You have
you
to
know,
jog my memory. You were speaking about, the tiers of art and the tiers of religion. I it if memory serves me correctly, it's been a long time since I've dug deep into Hegel, but didn't he believe music to be the highest art form, or was it poetry? I don't know. I feel like it was, like, something that became, liberated from material became highest. I don't know. I'm
yeah,
trying to
oh, yeah, I
like,
should know this.
I feel like it was, like, sculpture was lower, and then it became
Yeah,
music and poetry.
I think it's poetry, but I'm remembering vaguely something about music as well. I should know that, and I can't say for sure. I'm not remembering correctly. I'll have to look again. It's been a long time since I've
Yeah,
looked at his aesthetics
and
and
he and he
how he arranges the arts.
and he has Christianity as the culmination of religion, does he not?
Yes, the so-called absolute religion. Yeah.
Yeah, which is
Uh,
so I
and
mean, this was just so fascinating to me when I first encountered Hegel to think about. Really, it was just fascinating to me. I did music at the time. It was like I was in some ways much more invested in music than I was my studies, which is something that has been inverted later in this mid period of my life. But um, yeah, that was so fascinating to me to see him rank and grade these things in his schema and the religions as well. I found that super fascinating. I think those lectures on aesthetics and religion, if I have this right, I think those were the things that gripped me the most about my time with Hegel.
mhm. Yeah, the lectures on the philosophy of religion I find are particularly accessible, and of course very controversial. The idea of um, stratifying religious traditions, putting them in a hierarchy. It's completely antithetical to the dominant spirit of academe today. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and he's been, I think rightly criticized for various forms of centrism, whether it's Eurocentrism, Christocentrism, and so on. Uh, and given his project, what he's trying to do, there's a plausible argument that can be made that you under certain criteria for coherence and for what constitutes wisdom, it is arguable that Christianity, in the form that he takes it, particularly with the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the Incarnation, these two in particular, certainly genetically, historically, as I argue in my other book, Coming Home, uh, you know, I believe that there would not have been the emergence of the planetary era, for instance, and not the emergence of modern science or the modern political revolutions without the dogmas of the Trinity and the Incarnation. I follow Blake in considering those, and Hegel and Jung in many ways, considering those to be a kind of great code, or like genetic code, for not only the European West, but emerging out of the European West, what Edgar Morin calls the planetary era. Um, but once it emerges, it leaves it behind in a way. Like this is the whole secularization hypothesis, that once once Christianity gives birth through scholasticism to the modern thinkers of like Descartes and Copernicus and even Newton, once that happens, the culture achieves a kind of relative autonomy through the Enlightenment that leads to the negation of Christianity and eventually with Nietzsche, the death of God and so on. But, Hegel is the first one to actually see the death of God per se as a necessary expression of the actualization of the Christian principle. So with the moment of incarnation is only completed when Jesus dies on the cross, right? So if a core if at the core of the Christian religion is the idea of the cosmic logos or the logic become flesh, which is incarnation, Hegel says that only mythopoeically, that is only completed when Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus dying on the cross prefigures the later cultural death of God for Hegel. Um, yeah, so where's that leading me? So it leads to a paradox. On the one hand, at least in terms of trying to trace the emergence of the planetary era and within it, the emergence of the science of wisdom through Hegel, which is the completion of the philosophical project begun by Plato, let's say. In trying to trace that genealogy, we see that Christianity plays the key role. And in that sense, it's the absolute religion. At the same time, once we see that, for Hegel, the form of Christianity, its mythic form, you don't need it anymore. It's sort of a ladder. And now that you've got wisdom, you don't need it. So Christianity may be the absolute religion, but once you realize that, arguably, you don't need Christianity anymore. And this is what the left-wing Hegelians did, starting with Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer and Karl Marx. They said, yeah, Hegel was right. Therefore, we don't need God. We don't need religion.
Right. That's the thing that's so fascinating to me about Hegel is, and this goes back to the comment about whether or not I was reading God into my philosophy texts. Um, what I found when I was studying Hegel is that I was in good company in the sense that there are these right Hegelians who viewed Hegel as a type of Protestant Thomas Aquinas in his systematizing. But the thing is, that was astounding to me, and perhaps it isn't all that uncommon if I were to zoom out and look at different philosophical and intellectual movements, is that how you could have such wildly distinct energized parties, although it seems like the left Hegelians have won out in the association with Marxism and atheism. It seemed very difficult for me to understand how you could read Hegel and completely jettison God from the equation. I mean, the first question that I'd have is, if let's just say it is true, and I'm not trying to stir up some sort of debate here about this, like this isn't a hill I'm going to die on. If you identify more with one paradigm or another, but let's just say that it is true that through his philosophical system you overcome the ultimate religion, which is Christianity. Um, Does that and does that mean you wouldn't have any use for the arts anymore? Would you have no use for, music and poetry and sculpture and things like that? I mean, are these completely extraneous aspects of what it means to be a human being? I doubt those same people would say that.
Yeah, I'm
So
totally with you there. Yeah, I'm totally with you.
okay.
Yeah. Um,
But I'm not a deep Hegelian, like, you're having these conversations is provoking some memories of my time with Hegel, but it's been at least 15 years, you know?
yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, my approach to Hegel, which is similar to my approach to Jung, has been to try to honor the insight into what I call complex holism, which
That's right. So
which
here we go. Yeah, we're
requires
back. Yes.
yeah, so which requires the ability to hang out in the tension of opposites, and one of these opposites is translating the mythopoeic, the religious, the aesthetic into the form of the concept, which is self-sufficient and constitutes the endpoint of wisdom. The other side is that yes, and you can only do that through ongoing engagement with the aesthetic and the religious. So you need to stay grounded in both symbol and concept, in both practicing community and isolated contemplation. Uh, and so whatever the opposites are that we're talking about in my own life, I've realized that I need both. I need the tension, the ongoing tension of both, without having to split them apart. In fact, to avoid splitting them apart, and to make them transparent to each other, so that if I meet somebody, sometimes I'll meet people, and I'm totally fine with God talk, and also when I'm alone at night, and sometimes when I pray, or I don't pray to the absolute spirit. I pray to pray to Mary, and God the Father, and so on. Um, but if I'm speaking philosophically, then I translate that into those categories. Or if I'm speaking to a Jungian, I'll translate it into the categories of analytical psychology. So I think you know
I
it's
like
good.
that. I
Yeah.
like I like that. I like that a lot. I'll perhaps tell you an anecdote off air sometime. Um, Big surprise, we're running up on an hour here, but I don't
Oh
wanna
my God,
be
that
yeah,
goes.
yeah, we lost track of time. But real quick, what I wanna do, Jordan, if you could progress us to slide 9 real quickly. Um, Here's this table that I put together. I think throughout our conversation, uh, these qualities of the distinction between Hegel's conception of God and Hegel's conception of God have come out. If someone, not that this is gospel, this is just a quick and dirty thing that I built with AI a couple days ago before we came on here. I don't know if there's an aspect of this you really want to object to, but if someone wanted to pause the screen and screenshot that, do you have any objection to what's going on here?
Not an objection, but just a qualification I noticed with scope to begin
Mm-hmm.
with.
Sure.
It's true. It's definitely true that Jung focuses on the individual, and Hegel focuses on the cosmological, or and the historical, and so on. And like Jung, in Ion, especially, even in his book Psychological Types and Answer to Job, uh, he's definitely engaging the evolution of consciousness on the collective level, and
Certainly.
in his book Modern Man in Search of a Soul as well. So Jung definitely has a collective psychology, and a psychohistory, and a view of the evolution of consciousness. Um, Hegel has some stuff to say about the individual and his system, but so yeah, there is that polarity, but I would say there's also some yin and yang there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Clearly this is not exhaustive. So, but yeah,
yeah,
I think you're right.
but yeah, but just generally fine.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
It
yeah,
kind of works. I wanted to, and if we could progress, unless you wanted to dwell here a moment longer, I
no,
did want to progress to the last slide.
hmm
Um, I, I guess, you know, I've always been fascinated with the story of Hegel taking an opportunity to witness Napoleon and talk about how he saw the world spirit
on
riding
horseback.
by
Yeah,
on horseback. I was kind of curious if you could talk about how Young, because Young, I think Young talks about Napoleon. I know he talks about Hitler in some places. Um, h- how they view world historical figures and how that might be related to the collective unconscious for Young and analogously to the world spirit for
yeah.
Hegel. If you could
Mhm.
just riff on that, and perhaps we can close our session out with your thoughts on this.
Okay. Yeah. Well, both Hegel and Jung recognized that what Hegel calls the world spirit, what Jung also calls in the Red Book the spirit of the times.
Right.
So in the Red Book, he distinguishes between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. And that we could think of that in terms of the spiritus mundi, or the world spirit, versus the anima mundi, which is like the soul dimension. Okay, so Jung has that idea of the world spirit as well. So both Hegel and Jung recognize that certain individuals become lightning rods and catalysts for the actualization of potentials of the world spirit, which Jung will relate to the collective unconscious in the archetypes. Hegel will relate it more to the inner the inner telos of the historical process. So for um, Hegel is very explicit that history has a goal. Something is trying to happen in history. Jung too says that not only with the individual, but in the evolution of consciousness, what's wanting to happen is the creation of consciousness. So there, for Hegel, it's freedom. For Jung, it's the creation of consciousness. Hegel says that world historical individuals are those individuals through whom, often without them being conscious of the fact, the telos of the world spirit is furthered, gets actualized.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and Jung certainly saw this with the case of Jesus. So when he talks about Jesus, he says that whoever the person of Jesus was, it was immediately submerged in these projections from the spirit of the age and the collective unconscious around the archetype of the fish and precession of the equinoxes and the God man and so on, and that was playing a central role for Jung, which he explores in his book Answer to Job, namely the differentiation of consciousness out of the participation mystique of identification with the collective toward a more individualized, self-reflexive potentials. And this is what the whole first axial age was about as well. So Jung sees Christ as the most epical world historical individual, and a kind of antichrist later is Hitler in many ways, as you mentioned, but who nevertheless, even for Jung for a while, thought, oh, well, Hitler is definitely capturing something about the spirit of the age, which for a while Jung could see was maybe needed in a way. This uh, not the fascism, but the revaluation of connection to the earth and of the mythopoeic imagination and so on. So he could see the appeal of Nazism, but then when he saw that it was trapped in a mass psychosis, or what he called mass mindedness, and even maybe possessed by the spirit of Wotan, the Germanic god of war, he completely distanced himself from Nazism, of course, in a way that Heidegger did not manage to do. Heidegger, stayed identified with it.
Right.
Jung flirted very early on, curious, but then very quickly saw what was going on and distanced himself from it. Nevertheless, he recognized that Hitler uh, was a world historical individual in that sense, but it wasn't really. It turned out that it wasn't furthering consciousness. It was a regression into psychosis and mass mindedness. So this is where, yeah, there's similarities between Hegel and Jung, and Hegel didn't recognize so much the possibility of mass psychosis in the way that Jung did. So that would be the difference.
This is all fascinating to me. I I'm a lot of my research is really animated by a hyperfixation on Stanley Kubrick,
Mhm.
personally, and I think a lot of what's going on in Kubrick's films can be traceable back to Jung's work. I mean, it's pretty explicit in a number of places, the references to Jung. He even calls the monolith in an interview a Jungian God concept. But and there's then the explicit within his films, where Joker talks about doing the duality of man in Full Metal Jacket, if you're familiar with that scene. But I think about what you said about certain individuals being world historical figures and not knowing it. And the deeper I go into this line of research, I'm really starting to think that Kubrick was one of these people.
Huh.
This that the was this lightning rod that something larger was coursing through.
Yeah.
Um, I don't have the language to fully express it yet, but I don't, maybe it seems silly from your perspective to say that about a filmmaker. There's some very unique phenomenon that I've seen in his films. I'm not particularly obsessed with cinema, but there's something special going on there. I
Mm.
don't know if I don't know if that I don't know if you have any. it it this I feel like this is going to be a fertile direction to take my own research.
Yeah, well, certainly 2001, I mean, was just so much there. I mean,
Well,
so precious.
I
Yeah,
think it's a I mean, I have to I need to do some presentations and some deep research on Jung and this evolution of consciousness that you speak of, because really 2001 is a story about the evolution of consciousness.
exactly.
And my suspicion is that it's gonna map perfectly, maybe not perfectly, but map, uh, in an interesting way to what Jung has to say about that. So
And it mapped, by the way, perfectly on Stan Grof's, uh, um, understanding of, the perinatal process and the death rebirth archetype, but we can talk about that on another
oh,
occasion.
yeah, you gotta illuminate me on that.
Yeah,
So
it's amazing how closely it's perfect. I remember like in when I first started teaching in 1988, my undergraduate students and in my course on psychology of religion, I would bring in 2001 as an illustration of Stan Grof's basic perinatal matrices. But I'll share that with you later.
yeah, please do. I mean, it makes me wanna sign you up to we look, I'm always happy to have you back, and, you know, I would like to talk about, uh, your other texts too, Coming Home and the Planetary Era. Is that the name of your
Yeah,
book?
there's Coming Home, the birth and transformation of the planetary era, and then my more recent one, Becoming Gaia. Yeah,
Okay, well, look, I'll always happy to talk about your texts or Kubrick or the
whatever. We have so
TARDISes
much we
or
could talk.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Uh, I think I'm gonna try to, impose some discipline here. We probably should
Yep,
bring this
so
session to
good.
a close. And Sean, thank you so much for coming back. I'll try to have this up and to you ASAP. It might be later in the weekend, but we'll see what we can do.
Wonderful. Great seeing you, Luke.
All right, take care.